I mainly wanted to talk to you about free will. We've already been going
Oh, okay.
for over half an hour.
That's
So,
weird.
because we just finished a unit on free will. Okay,
Yeah.
so I know you have views about this. So,
Yeah.
are you a compatibilist or an incompatibilist?
So I my views on free will are complicated. Surprise. I think that I view the question about free will as really having two components. One is, where is the bar for having free will? What does it require to have it? And then, do humans, at least some of us, some of the time, get over that bar, right? And I actually think that most of the answer is going to be determined by where we set the bar, right? Uh, because I don't think there's too much disagreement about what among at least among scientifically informed people about what humans are like. So what do I mean by the different places where you could set the bar? So setting the bar high really means that humans have a special ability to act outside of the ordinary mechanistic clockwork of the universe, right? So to take, a classic example from Thomas Nagel, you're in line at the cafeteria and you see the peach and you see the chocolate cake and you love chocolate cake, but you're watching your weight, right? And at that moment, you face this momentous choice, right? And one understanding of what it takes to have free will is up until the very moment that I choose, both of those possibilities are truly open, that they are not determined by the sum of the past, where the past is a function of the state of the universe before I was born, the laws of physics, and perhaps the outcomes of random quantum mechanical events, right? But and if that's what it means to have free will, that even given the past, it is possible for you as a special human mind to go this way or to go that way. If that's the bar, then I've got to be a hard determinist and say that we don't have free will,
Right.
right? If the bar is lower, uh, what would a lower bar look like? Well, evidence. The idea is that having free will is not about having some special metaphysical power to contravene the laws of physics. It is about having a certain kind of psychological structure. So for Harry Frankfurt, it's about having a two-level structure where we not only do the things we want, but do the things that we want to want, right? For others, it's a matter of having a certain kind of capacity for rational reflection, right? And this is reflected in the fact that we say, look, adults are more responsible than children. People who are mentally healthy are more responsible than people who have certain kinds of mental illness, right? And various other real world differences like that. Those are different. Those aren't differences in metaphysical powers. Those are differences in a kind of psychological development or sophistication. So, okay, so now the question is, what do we mean when we say that we have what someone has or doesn't have free will? And I think the answer really is we don't have a coherent view intuitively. That is, if you ask people, could somebody, Nichols and Knobe did a famous experiment. They asked people, in a world where everything is determined, and they explain in a friendly way what determinism means, could anyone really be fully responsible? And people say, and people say no. And then they ask other people, and they say, imagine this guy Bob lives in a world where everything is fully determined, right? And he falls in love with his secretary and decides that the only way to be with her is to kill his family, so he kills his wife and kids. Is he morally responsible? And people say yes, right? And so, that experiment, I think, more than any other that I've seen, just beautifully demonstrates that we do not have consistent thinking about this. Now, Eddie Namias and others have looked at these experiments and done some of their own to say, well, people are kind of confused. They think that what's going on in a mechanistic world is that your thinking is kind of bypassed by physical stuff that's outside your psychology. But then that raises the question, well, why do people make that assumption? Isn't it because we assume that people are ghosts in the machine, that we are minds that are independent of the physical flow of things? So my overall take is there are aspects of our thinking that are kind of compatibilist, and there are aspects of our thinking that are incompatibilist. And when you combine incompatibilism with science, you end up with hard determinism. Um, so I think it's kind of a mush. And what I would say, my ultimate conclusion is, I think there's a real sense in which we have free will, but there's also a real sense in which we don't. And where that bit that we don't matters is about retribution. that it's about punishing people simply because they deserve it and not because it does any kind of good in terms of preventing them or others from doing bad things or taking dangerous people off the streets. So that is where I ultimately come down, that I think that understanding what's really going on with free will might not make us say we don't have free will at all, but the kind of free will that we have, I think, is not enough to justify certain kinds of very widespread practices that are embodied in our everyday thinking, but also in our criminal justice system.
And you've done some work which suggests that spreading the news that, or promulgating the view that we don't have free will, or
you heard the good news, the bad news,
does affect people's attitudes towards retributive punishment.
Yeah. So this is work done with Azim Sharif and a large team of others. So in 2004, John Cohen and I published the paper sort of laying out these general ideas about retribution, and the basic idea was that if we understand that we live in a mechanistic world and that we're just part of it, that it doesn't mean we'll give up on all of responsibility and free will, but retribution really looks bad, right? And then 10 years later, we did a series of studies, but my favorite one is the one at the end where we actually tracked students who took a cognitive neuroscience course versus students who took a control course like on geography or something like that. And before and after the course, we asked them, I think we asked them to deal with a specific vignette. Like, so this is a story about a guy who gets in a bar fight and ends up killing somebody. And we try to set up the question about what should happen to him so that it really focuses on retribution. So we say, look, there's a minimum 2-year prison sentence that anyone, that he has to do. This will maximize any effect of deterrence in terms of having, stopping him from doing stuff like this, stopping other people from doing this. After this, he's no longer a threat that you need to keep off the streets. But some people think that for a crime of like that, where you killed somebody, 2 years is just not enough. There has to be more prison time. How much more prison time do you want to add? And the people who took the cognitive neuroscience course, which was not about criminal justice or anything like that, it was just about understanding the mind as a mechanical system, were more likely to give reduced retribution. Now, I have to say, I haven't looked at the paper in a while. I may be confusing the measure from one experiment with the manipulation from the other experiment. But the overall takeaway from this series of experiments is when you get people to appreciate that human behavior is ultimately mechanical, right? It doesn't mean necessarily that people give up on free will, but they become less retributive as they predicted. Now, that's not a normative claim, that's a descriptive claim. But insofar as our behavior is following something that might make sense, then there's a kind of normative aspect to it.
Right. Okay, so I've already taken up way too much of your time. So one last question, if I may, since it's extremely topical. So we are about to read rules, not just Nozick, and by the time the students see this, they will know about rules, thought experiment of the Veil of Ignorance, and you have a paper coming out which is called Veil of Ignorance Reasoning Favors Allocating Resources to Younger Patients. This may be of interest to the students in particular during the COVID-19 crisis.
Yeah.
So can you tell us just a bit about that study?
Yeah, so that recent paper is really on top of a paper that came out in 2019, which then is based on years of thinking about Rawls. So the gist of Rawls's famous thought experiment, Rawls is asking, how should a society be organized, right? And Rawls's idea is that, well, the answer to that question, it should be, whatever we would choose if we didn't know who in that society we were going to be. So the idea is a just society is a fair society. It's one that you would want to live in if you couldn't bias your decision by saying, oh, well, I'm rich, so I want a society that has low taxes for rich people. Or, oh, I'm poor, so I want to live in a society that has low taxes for poor people. If you didn't know who you were going to be, the society that you would choose would be a just one. That's Rawls's idea, right? And then Rawls, with that platform, goes on to make a further claim, which is, and the society that we would choose is not a utilitarian society. It is a society that would follow certain other principles. Now, as I explain in my book, and especially in some long endnotes, which I like, but the editor thought was too complicated for general audience. So you can, if you want to look, check those out. I argue that actually, if you take the Rawlsian thought experiment seriously, it actually probably does lead to a utilitarian conclusion, which is a conclusion that the economist John Harsanyi came to, who developed the veil of ignorance idea around the same time, but took it in a different direction. What we're doing in this paper is something more micro. We're taking the Rawlsian veil of ignorance and applying it to specific dilemmas with specific deci- decisions about specific cases. So, our first, we did the footbridge case. So, a natural thought, most people say it's wrong to push the guy off the footbridge, even if it will save 5 lives. And if you ask someone like MIT's own Judith Jarvis Thompson, why is it wrong? She and others are likely to say something like, well, it's violating that person's rights to use them as a trolley stopper in that way, right? Um, well, so an interesting, I think, counter to that is to say, well, there are 6 people whose lives are at stake in this situation. The guy on the footbridge, the dense man, as we'll call him, or woman or whatever, and the 5 on the tracks. And we can pull the Rawlsian idea and say, 6 people, if we didn't know who we were going to be, if you didn't know who you were going to be, what would you want the decision maker to do? And by the way, this idea comes from a paper by your own Casper Hare. I can't remember the title of the paper, but anyway, so do credit to Casper for thinking about this, applying to specific dilemmas. Um, and my thought was actually, and Casper's thought as well, if you didn't know which of these 6 people you were gonna be, you would want the person to push, because that would give you a 5 out of 6 chance of living and a 1 out of 6 chance of dying, instead of a 5 out of 6 chance of dying and a 1 out of 6 chance of living. In other words, if you were really thinking about the consequences, but thinking about it, or if you're really thinking about it impartially, you would focus on the consequences and not worry so much about the squeamishness of pushing, if you want to sort of put
Yep.
a derisive gloss on that. And that's what we found. And then we applied this idea to other things like self-driving cars. Would you want the car with one person in it to swerve into the brick wall in order to save 9 people? And we also did this with charities. We said, if you could help one person in the United States where it's expensive to prevent blindness, or 2 people in India where a cheaper surgery will prevent 2 people from going blind. If you didn't know which of those 3 people you were going to be, where would you want a donation to go, right? And what we find is that with all these things, I should say, we don't just ask people to give an answer to the veil of ignorance question. We then ask them to go back to the original moral question and say, okay, so what do you think is actually right? And this was what Rawls was doing. He gave us this thought experiment and Harsanyi, what would you want if you didn't know who you were going to be? And then said, okay, well, in light of your answer to that question, what do you think is actually just about society, right? So what we found over and over again is that when you ask people to think about the veil of ignorance, you take the situation and say, what would you want if you didn't know who you were going to be? People tend to give a utilitarian answer there. And then when you go back to the original question, including a case where people could actually make a donation to India versus the United States, people are more likely to give the utilitarian judgment or do the utilitarian thing after they've had that thought experiment. In the COVID case, what we're doing is, instead of having a decision about more people versus fewer people, it's a decision about more life years versus fewer life years. So if you have a young COVID patient, say someone who's 25, or an older COVID patient, say someone who's 65, and let's say that we expect both people to live to age 80. If you save the younger person, then you are saving 55 life years, right? If you save the older person, then you're saving 15 life years. And so we did an experiment where we asked people, if you didn't know whether you were going to be the younger person or the older person, would you want the ventilator to be allocated to the younger person or the older person? If you have that allocated to the younger person, you have a 50% chance of getting to live another 55 years, but you have a 50% chance of dying at age 65. Whereas if you allocate it to the older person, you have a 50% chance of living another 15 years, but a 55% or 50% chance that you'll die at age 25, right? And there are people overwhelmingly, young and old, say that they would rather have the ventilator allocated to the younger person. And what we found was that this didn't do much to change the votes of the judgments of younger people. But when older people responded to this, their initial response was, hell no, don't discriminate against older people. That's ageist. You should flip a coin between the younger and the older person. But when we asked them to do the veil of ignorance on this case, they said, okay, if I didn't know who I was going to be, I'd rather have it go to the younger person. And then when we said, okay, well, what do you think the policy should actually be in the hospital when there are these scarce resources for COVID? And this dramatically changed the judgments of the older people, and made them say, okay, I think it's actually more fair for it to go to the younger people. So this is obviously a timely application of this, and sorry to say that we are heading into a surge, especially in rural parts of the U.S. and perhaps everywhere, more due to people being more indoors in the winter. So this may sadly become as relevant as ever. Although I think we're better prepared for it. But anyway, that's the
okay.
line of
Excellent. Well, we've been going for almost an hour, so that was way over time. This is a tremendous, lots of interesting material for the students, and as I say, yeah, the course is about 30% the philosophy of Josh Greene anyway, so this was extremely valuable. So Josh, thank you so much.
Thank you. This is fun, and please, students, feel free to email me with questions, thoughts. I'm
okay. Well, that's a great offer.
Digitally or otherwise.
Yeah, I'll provide your email to the students. Okay, thanks again.
Okay.